Hi everybody, Richard Tromans here again, Artificial Lawyer TV. Just doing a quick product walkthrough with Minesh at Amplifi. It's a really interesting product which I saw at MDR Lab a few weeks ago. I'll let Minesh tell you a bit more about it, but fundamentally it's about making writing, particularly legal writing, much more clear and easy to read. Hi Minesh.
Hi, Richard. How are you? Thank you very much for this opportunity for a product walkthrough. So, in its simplest form, Amplify is a novel technology that enables the legal sector for the first time to identify risk in the language used in their documents. Sitting behind the platform is proprietary technology, the brains, shall we say, where we have got multiple engines that look at contextual relationship between the words and the language used. And this then gives it a risk rating. And the way we show that in the platform is via color coding. So on the left-hand side, we have a feature called risk heat mapping, where you can see variations of colors, and red means that it is a very difficult sentence. And the technology will identify risk both at sentence level and paragraph level. And
Actually,
what
let me just pause you there just for one second, just so that people who are watching this understand. And when you say risk, we're not talking about the liability cap might be beyond what our company playbook has agreed. What we're actually talking about here is that literally the language itself has reached a level of complexity or lack of transparency that there's a risk in misunderstanding. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. So the Consumer Rights Act, sorry, requires information to be intelligible. So this is intelligibility risk. And as you've kind of highlighted, the risk is very much around, will the person who's reading this information be able to not only read it, but able to understand it and process it and act on it? And this is what our proprietary technology highlights. And what we then do is help the drafter guide them through a unique process. And we highlight why it is complex and what needs to change and how to change it. So this could be that the sentence is too long, there's punctuation in the wrong place, or the words are too complex, or even the sentence is too complex. And we would give a recommendation at word level and then also at a sentence level. So essentially what we're doing here is we are creating efficiencies within the drafting process. So first of all, identifying where the risk is within that document. And secondly, telling the drafter what are the top things that they can do that would improve the document from an intelligibility perspective. And ultimately, all of this sits on top of an intelligent audit trail, which is for regulatory reporting and MI compliance.
Gotcha. So another question: these documents that you might say, well, improving, to put it simply, who are they for? I mean, is this a like a contract that two commercial lawyers for different parties would be looking at, or is this primarily for consumers? So it might be the legal footnotes to, I don't know, an energy contract or something,
So
where it's aimed at people who are not lawyers.
so our use case to date has been your traditional terms and conditions. So terms and conditions you may get for buying a financial product. But also other types of legal contracts, such as employment contracts, as well as employment policies. So one of our pilots very much focused on employment policies because they recognized that that was a big issue, challenge that they had internally. So essentially the documentation that can be used within Amplify is any type of communication that the legal team would generally sign off. So that could be from your traditional contracts through to pre-sale, post-sale information, through to general communication. So in financial services, technically all information has to be signed off by the legal team. Some of the other use cases that we have identified with our clients have been where English is not the first language, so where they've got global teams and they create their contracts centrally in English, and then it has to be localized in that local language, and they've recognized that they have challenges there. So by simplifying the baseline document, they've identified that this could kind of help them. We're also working with regulators. So this is a regulator looking at their own regulation for their members. So the intelligibility of their regulation. So if you take anti-money laundering in the legal sector, which is a big challenge and a big issue, that regulation affects anyone from within a law firm, from the receptionist all the way down to the partner. And that is just a use case which has been highlighted to us. But it is essentially any type of communication that is underpinned by legal or regulatory requirements.
Got you. And have you got anything else you can show us?
Yes. So sitting behind Amplifi is our engine. This is the heart of Amplifi. So this is where our proprietary technology sits. And what we've done, which is novel, is that we have combined multiple readability frameworks with classical linguistic models using machine learning and AI. And this is a novel approach. These are just some of the language models that we've used. And this enables us to build our proprietary intelligibility score.
Interesting. So these things on the left, I have to admit, actually, I've heard of one of those, but these are all well-known readability frameworks that are well established already.
Yes.
These are like open source things, you might say.
Yes.
Got you. And then on the right, where it says linguistic models, these are academically developed, you might
Different
say
types of models,
through which models,
yeah,
through which to judge. So you put the two things together, and then you get from this score, this beginner to zero.
Yes, and these are just some of the models that we use in frameworks. So we use 15 plus different models and frameworks, and then we also overlay that with our proprietary data sets as well. So, and we are underpinned by the Common European Framework, language framework, which is CIFA, which very much looks at word complexity and concepts. The scale is a beginner, which is aimed at an 8-year-old, to an advanced, which is a post-graduation level.
Gotcha. And so would a regulator set, what reading age, which sounds obviously a bit incongruous, in the world of commercial lawyers who are all obviously super highly educated, but I guess we do have to consider the broader population don't necessarily have sort of photographic memories and sort of postgraduate level reading levels. But I mean, if you had something like, I don't know, like I say, the T's and C's for an energy contract, gas bill, right? Put it simply. Do they say, well, this has a reading age of X, and then you have to calibrate the language to meet that reading age? Or how does it work?
So regulators wouldn't necessarily say that the document has to be at a certain reading age. What they do say is that it has to be intelligible. And it is up to the firm then to kind of decide how they go about it. So there is guidance. There is guidance from the European Courts of Justice, which specifically talks about intelligibility and the criteria for intelligibility, where a person needs to be not only be able to read it, but be able to understand it, and then be able to make an informed decision.
Yeah. Well, actually, it raises some really interesting points there, doesn't it? Which is that, and I'd almost question actually whether reading age is the best way, because you can communicate really complex ideas, which perhaps an 8-year-old would have no chance of understanding, but using very, 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 very clear language that perhaps somebody who had a postgraduate education would really engage with, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? We could be talking about some very, 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 very complex layered levels of logic, but we're using such beautifully clear English that probably an 8-year-old wouldn't gather it, what was going on, but pretty much everyone else could. You know,
Yeah.
the
Um,
that's I mean it's an interesting one, isn't it? I suppose I guess the reason for me that this is particularly interesting is we it connects to things like standardization, about the actual work of lawyers negotiating contracts and so forth, self-serve documents inside large corporates, you know, like an NDA or some other type of document. And I suppose yeah, you referenced yourself already, employment contracts. So I guess I suppose this is for at least the artificial lawyer audience, which obviously is probably not so much on the B2C side, but the B2B side. I mean, how much relevance do you think this will have for the B2B world?
so very high thinking, and just kind of going back to the linguistic modeling, we've got a huge research program, and we work with academics because language is complex and the way language is structured, and we use kind of science and research which kind of underpins our development. So and the way language fits in with society as well and behavior. So this is just give you some idea of the research work that sits behind it. But working in a B2B context, one of our use cases has been around SMEs. Just because somebody is an owner of a business or a director doesn't mean that they've got the necessary knowledge or the resources to be able to understand legal contracts as such. So they are essentially a consumer brain outside of their job title. And one of the use cases we have is around SME contracts, B2B contracts, because the challenge that this global firm has is that the end user is not able to understand the information, so they're going backwards and forwards all the time.
Gotcha. And I suppose also, I mean, you've got it there on the very first line for people who don't know what it stands for. But I used to be a TEFL teacher many decades ago, so I don't recognize what it is, which is teaching of English as a second language,
Yeah,
or in this case, the reading of
the
English.
reading,
English is not
reading
your
of it.
first language.
Yeah, and what we found is readability is a really good metric, but it has its limitations, and I think a lot of organisations and generally have kind of stuck to the readability age. But what they haven't really looked at is the intelligibility, and the intelligibility is the actual legal position.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, of course, you know, having someone who's lived abroad and traveled a lot, you know, the fact that you're clever in language A doesn't mean that you can carry that ability over to languages B, C, and D, which you may have
Mm.
to engage with. So that's another interesting point, isn't it? That, you know, you might have two lawyers, super bright, super clever, but because of a language barrier, there's a real sort of communication deficit.
Yes, yeah, and for somebody like me who is not only dyslexic but I've got multiple hidden disabilities, I grew up in an environment where my parents were refugees and we couldn't speak English for the first 8 years in the house. In the house, it was banned. So my parents' generation, my uncles and aunts, you know, their English is good now, but when they came here in the 70s, didn't have a good grasp of English. And especially where you've got now within society we live in today, which is multicultural, but English is not a second language for a lot of people out there who are coming in, who are either refugees or even grown up in quite tight knit communities. So he's kind of looking at that quite broader area of vulnerability, and language plays a really important part in the way organizations communicate
Yeah, no,
to their
absolutely.
audience.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. Well, look, well, let's stop the walkthrough there. Thank you very much for that. It's really, really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard.